All right, well, today we're going to be talking about confronting the dating culture, wisdom for dating and single Christians. And then next week, we'll be sticking with the idea of practical wisdom, looking at practical wisdom on choosing a marriage partner. And what we're talking about today mostly goes along with chapter 8 of my book. Now, we're getting into areas where there's going to be more, even among those who are really very orthodox in their Christian faith, there's going to be more differences of opinion, and that's fine. And I respect that, and you're going to find that I have a perspective, and that it's just hopefully worth considering as you look at your own lives, and then also how you're guiding the youth in this church, your own children, your own family, your grandchildren, and so forth. There might be some practical wisdom in here for you. So let's go ahead and let's look at this. I wanted to start with it's hard for me. Oh, there we go. An old Puritan love letter between John Winthrop and who was at the time his betrothed, his fiancée, Margaret Tyndall. It's absolutely gorgeous, but by the way, the Puritan idea was that they accepted everything that I said about what marriage is and what it's for, that the way that you go about identifying who you're going to ask to marry and then go through the process of getting ready to marry them and then marry them should be with those ends in mind. In other words, you're preparing for marriage as God defined it in order to carry out the purposes of marriage that God says He's identified. And what they did was they looked at the engagement period as one in which your ardor should be built up as you move towards marriage. You should be maintaining your purity, but you should be building ardor. You should be beginning to really engage in creating a bedrock of passion, love, delight. And that also meant, by the way, that they usually were not real fans of long engagements, because if you're going to be really focusing on really getting into this person and developing a strong physical, spiritual, emotional desire for them, you don't want to be doing that for 3 years. You might want to do it for about 6 months. Because the Puritans were also very earthy. I like to say that they had a faith that was planted where their feet actually touched good, honest dirt. And they viewed us as natural creatures with natural limits. So we'll just leave it at that. So you kind of see this in this letter. Let me go ahead and put this up. I think the letter's up. And by the way, if you ever think of dour Puritans, please get that out of your mind. They were mostly criticized, during the period of Puritanism, they were mostly criticized for being too loose. Your clothes are too colorful, you guys are a little too wild, you're kind of into sex a little bit too much. Why do you have entire sermons on sex? Actually, the criticism they received in their lifetimes was, you guys are a little bit out of the loop here. You're kind of antinomian. You're too loose. You're not strict enough. Literally, that's actually true. And now, my sweet love, let me a while solace myself in the remembrance of our love, of which this springtime of our acquaintance can put forth as yet no more but the leaves and blossoms, because they're waiting to get married. Only leaves and blossoms right now. While the fruit lies wrapped up in the tender bud of hope. A little more patience will disclose this good fruit and bring it to some maturity. Let it be our care and labor to preserve these hopeful buds from the beasts of the field, and from frosts and other injuries of the air, lest our fruit fall off ere it be ripe, or lose aught in the beauty and pleasantness of it. Let us pluck up such nettles and thorns as would defraud our plants of their due nourishment. Let us prune off superfluous branches. Let us not stick at some labor in watering and manuring them. The plenty and goodness of our fruit shall recompense us abundantly. Our trees are planted in a fruitful soil. The ground and pattern of our love is no other but that between Christ and his dear spouse. Do you see him referring that our marriage, like all marriages, symbolizes the relationship of Christ and the church? By the way, very tasteful ways of saying, let's grow in our desire for each other, but let's wait for the proper time. Of whom she speaks as she finds him, my well-beloved is mine, and I am his. Now, this is a secular couple. They wrote a really wonderful essay on courtship. And what they were talking about was their experience at the University of Chicago as professors there, dealing with people who had been destroyed and wasted by the modern dating environment, by repetitive sexual relationships, by strings of broken relationships, and found themselves looking to people like Jane Austen to try to find some guide as to how to get out of this mess they were in and find a better way, a more lovely way to find and marry the right person. So they were really just talking about the burnout they were experiencing. And they said, anyone interested in improving relationships between men and women today and tomorrow must proceed by taking a page from yesterday. And that's true. So it's kind of interesting. By the way, I tell this to my students all the time. I want my daughters to be looking for a Darcy or a Bingley, not a Wickham. I want them to form a marriage more like Elizabeth Bennet's uncle and Aunt Gardner, and a little bit less like the marriage that she was experiencing in her own home, which was, as you recall, an unsuitable match that they had to suffer through every day. So it's kind of interesting because the Casses are talking about that. Suddenly, by the way, have you noticed the explosion of interest in Jane Austen in recent years? Why do you think that is? They're lost. Christianity has an answer to that. And now, on the earthy themes, here's some earthy proverbs. He who finds, by the way, proverbs are written to men, so they always come from that perspective. But they're not just for men. That's how they're written. They're addressed that way. He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord, Proverbs 18:22. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels, 31:10. But on the other hand, it is better to live in the corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a quarrelsome wife. On the other hand, it is better to live in a desert land than with a quarrelsome and fretful woman. Great to be married well, not so great to mess that decision up. So, with that in mind, we go to modern recreational dating. I'm going to come up with a nice acronym from it, MRD. But maybe, okay. And let me point something out, a couple things I always point out to my students. First of all, how many people have heard of this whole dating courtship controversy? I'm into courtship, you're into dating, blah, blah, blah. I kiss dating goodbye. I stay away from that completely. I don't care what you call it. There's wise and unwise, biblical and unbiblical ways to do things. And there's a lot of room for variation across time and place, and even from one family to another as to what works. So I don't really like to say, oh, you should do courting, not dating. By the way, the word courtship actually comes from the term courtly, and courtly type of romantic relationships were almost always adulterous. So the word courtship actually comes out of the formation of adulterous relationships in medieval royal courts. So if you really like that word courtship, think about just a moment where it came from. We want to be careful here. What we're talking about is finding, identifying, and wooing a mate, whatever you choose to call that. But the other thing, on the other hand, is that we tend to think that the way we do things is normal and every other thing is odd. But in fact, our dating system is, at this point, about 100 years old. And the track record of it, and if you want to get a different view on this, talk to somebody from Saudi Arabia about how they think about the way we go about marrying people. The track record of it has not been that good. So in other words, there are things here to critique. But that doesn't mean that we have to reject the word or go to some weird, arranged marriage situation or anything like that. That's not the point. However, to take this thing for granted and to assume, and here's I think people our age tend to do, it worked for me. Well, did it work for all your friends? So in other words, approach it critically from a biblical perspective. How well does this get us where God wants us to be in our marriages? A marriage as God defined it, fulfilling the purposes that God has for it generally and for you as an individual. How well does this vehicle get you there? And for your children, is this vehicle going to get them there, and will it get them there safely? Will it get them there safely? Okay, so the rise of modern recreational dating. From the colonial era, the emphasis was on seeking a suitable spouse. Nobody looked for a boyfriend or girlfriend. The idea of I'm looking for a girlfriend, I'm looking for a boyfriend, that never crossed their mind. They were looking for a suitable spouse. And so as they engaged in relationships with people of the opposite sex during that period of their lives, and they're actively considering different possibilities, they're thinking, I'm looking for a husband. I'm looking for a wife. Nobody was looking for a boyfriend. Nobody was looking for a girlfriend. That language didn't exist for them. That thought pattern did not exist for them. In that process, they sought parental guidance but not force, because marriage was to be a voluntary commitment entered into through informed consent, in which the people honestly loved each other, and that love would grow and last over a lifetime. And so the idea that you would force somebody to marry somebody else was not part of their thinking. No, there needs to be, but on the other hand, the idea that all the wisdom you need is locked up in you and the other 15-year-olds that you know. I guess you could play some games with that, right? If you got 10, 15-year-olds, then you have 150 years worth of experience. No, you've got 10, 15-year-olds. They don't know their left hand from their right. They don't know you that well, and they certainly probably don't know what a lasting marriage requires. So they had parental guidance, but not force. They had choice, but not force. And they balanced the need for premarital intimacy and affection with the need to protect virtue. And by the way, the illegitimacy rate, for example, in colonial America actually went up a little bit. And the pastors actually noticed it, and they said, well, because we're creating more opportunities for real intimacy between people interested in marrying each other but not having married each other yet, and we want them to have time alone together, that means that from time to time they're going to slip up. And when they slip up, they're probably going to get pregnant. That the way they solved that was by speeding up the wedding. And we know this is true because there's actually, the parish has kept really good records. And so if you have a baby born 7 months after the marriage, right, somebody jumped the altar. And the rates of that were in fact quite high. So they were not unrealistic people. They said, look, if we want people to form lasting unions, we have to give them time alone with each other where they're really going to be forming a deep emotional attachment and being sure that they actually love each other, right? But if we allow that to happen as opposed to all these artificial barriers from the old world, then stuff's going to happen from time to time. And when that happens, we just speed up the wedding. Now, you don't think of them this way, do you? But that is in fact actually true. So they were constantly trying to figure out ways to balance these things, but they wanted it all to come out okay in the end. So I don't know how many of you have ever seen this. Does anybody know what this is? There are people around, probably not right down here, but around us there are lots of people that actually probably still do this.
Bundling.
This is bundling. And here's the situation. You're in a small farmhouse and it's really, really cold outside. On the other hand, your daughter has become very interested in a young man, and they need to be able to spend time alone together. Now, how do you do that? Well, what you do is you run a board down the middle of the bed. You give them lots of layers of clothing. You put them each on one side of the bed, and then they sleep together. But they're not supposed to cross the board. Okay? Now, what that means is that you're creating the opportunity for the formation of knowledge and intimacy between an unmarried couple, while at the same time trying to protect their virtue. Now, this isn't the only way you did it, and there were huge controversies in the Amish community, for example, about whether or not this practice should be tolerated, but many, in fact, did. And here you have a kind of a modern depiction of it, but that's literally what happened. And oftentimes, they would be put in the bed by the women, the older women, who would sit there and kind of converse with them for a while and then leave. Now, did the board always stay there? No. In which case you sped up the wedding. But the fact is that this may be an awful idea. I'm not going to, that's not the point. The point is that they were consciously trying to get people into the type of marriage that they felt God wanted them to have and balance these different considerations. The influence of the elders, the need to maintain purity, the need to foster intimacy, the need to make sure that people really did feel they were right for each other, that they weren't blindly going into a relationship under conditions that didn't allow, for some of the things that we can do. I mean, what do you do when it's 20 below out? And you live in a farmhouse with a loft, a living room, and a bedroom. You bundle. So, modern dating as we understand it literally arose during the 19th century among working class urban families. And it did because they were in really tiny houses in crowded areas. They suddenly are moving out of rural areas into these cities. They're in these tiny little houses where they're packed in there. And so for the boy and the girl have to go out. And so these working class urban families started practicing something that we would call modern dating. And then it was eventually adopted by the middle class during the 1920s. Up until then, the whole language of dating, by the word, if the word dating was used, it was used for group activities often sponsored and chaperoned by a church. You seen Anne of Green Gables? Do you notice how they used the church picnics to help boys and girls find each other? That's what a date was. A date was not a guy pulling up in front of a house, honking a horn, the girl goes out, they go out, and then the father's checking his watch at 10 to see if they come back. They just simply didn't do that. That didn't exist among middle-class families until the 1920s. That's how recent it is. So the idea is, well, this is just normal. This is what humans do. No, I mean, it's not necessarily abnormal. It's just not. Human society's got along without this for quite a long time. Okay, it made sense in light of the shift to urban life, smaller homes, longer periods in school, leading to the rise of a recognized teen period, et cetera. By the word, the idea of teenagers or a prolonged period of adolescence is also less than 100 years old. Less than 100 years old. The word teenager didn't exist to them. You were a child and then you were an adult. You were a young adult or an older adult. There was no teenagers. It just didn't exist. That whole mindset did not exist. Now what this meant was, right off the bat, you had a bigger role for peers and male suitors, while a lesser role for parents, lesser oversight for parents, and oftentimes less choice by women, believe it or not, right? The woman is standing around waiting for somebody to ask her out, right? As opposed to being in church functions, each actively seeking the other, until an attachment forms, and then a question is asked of the girl's parents: can we pursue this at the next level? It's a very different setup. By the mid-20th century, this model had become completely dominant. And it now became detached from the pursuit of marriage partners. You're no longer looking for a marriage partner. You're looking for a boyfriend or a girlfriend. It became a recreational activity with criteria for desirable dating partners being attached to recreational type of criteria. Who's going to make me more popular? Who's going to increase my status? How can I compete effectively with the girls who are dating the handsomer guys? How can I have fun? Does this guy make me laugh? In other words, you began having all these things come in that are really more tied to dating itself, recreational dating itself, not towards, is this someone of the character and type with whom I can stay for the rest of my life? The focus became heavily peer-oriented. Who do my friends like? They began dating earlier, and by 1960, the average start date for dating was the 9th grade. Now, when you're dating in the 9th grade, and by the way, the age of marriage is being pushed back also. Average age of marriage for men is now in the late 20s and early 30s, right? So you're starting early, marrying. By the way, just in case, as of about 2 years ago, the official average start date for dating in America is by the 8th grade. By the 8th grade. So you're starting to date on average before you enter the 8th grade, and you continue dating until you're 27 or 28 years old, or for men, about 30 or a little later. Do you see what's happening here? Okay. There's more dating partners. And those dating partners tend to be a more serial or steady dating partners. In other words, you're having intense relationships from an early age that normally involve a breakup at the end of it. And by the time you got married, you've done that over and over and over again. By the way, without a single word from the Bible or commitment to Christ at all, can you see why sociologists say there's going to be some outcomes to this? All you have to do is understand you're dealing with human beings, and there's going to be some outcomes to this. So today, we have later marriages and continued early onset of dating, leading to a very long period of dating and breaking up. And I'm trying to remember if I have this in my notes. I ran on Google while I was writing the book. I went onto another computer screen and I Googled breaking up. I Googled how to break up. I got 313 million hits in less than 1 second. The hits showed that Google understood the intent of my question. Do you know what I mean? In other words, the algorithms, they knew what I meant. And so I was getting every kind of breaking up that you can possibly imagine. Described, there were steps involved and so forth. But then, when I ran it slightly different, I end up at the pediatrician website pointing out why this is producing epidemic levels of suicide, drugs, and depression among kids who still haven't even gotten out of high school. Because you're throwing wrenching adult-sized emotional transitions on them repeatedly at the age of 14 and 15 years old. The other thing that's happened to us is that cohabitation out of wedlock prior to marriage is now the norm. In how many Hollywood films today does the person transition from a romantic attachment to an engagement and then to a wedding in which they move in together, versus in how many do they just move in? Anybody seen the more recent version of You've Got Mail, right? And for the woman involved, it's the guy leaves her live-in relationship so that Tom Hanks can move in. And that's the apex, but that's the happily ever after that the film ends on. The cohabitation is oftentimes serial, and it's increasingly serial. It is increasingly undertaken with no marital goal whatsoever. Less than 1 out of 4 cohabitors were engaged when they began cohabiting. Surveys of cohabiting couples showed that only 15%, was actually slightly less than 15% of currently cohabiting couples said that determining suitability for marriage was even a, quote, important goal. They did not list determining whether or not this person was a suitable marriage partner as an important goal for their live-in relationship. 85% of currently cohabiting people, they're not even thinking that they are even going to marry this person. And by the way, here's what makes it worse. Oftentimes, one does and one doesn't, and they have never talked about it. One of them thinks this is going to marriage. The other one thinks it's not. And by the way, cohabiting couples are as likely as married couples to be raising children. The percentages are the same. The same. The majority of young people now accept cohabitation outside of marriage, even in the professing church. And despite complete failure of any data to support the proposition at all, in fact the opposite, most now actually think that cohabitation increases their chances of marital success, while in fact the opposite is true. The analogy I use with my students is, you ever notice when your lips get dry, you lick them because you think it's a natural thing to do? But in fact, those make your lips drier because as they evaporate, it harms your lips, right? So in fact, for example, young people most likely to cohabit are ones whose parents have gone through a bad divorce. They're so afraid of divorce, they cohabit in order to prevent divorce. But in fact, by cohabiting, they increase the likelihood that they will get divorced. And not by a little, but by, in fact, quite a bit. This is through the most recent census data, and this is couples. So if you're skiing down that slope, you're not on the bunny slope. You probably should be wearing a helmet, knee pads, elbow pads. And by the way, that's only increasing. This is couples, not individuals. So for example, in 2016, there were 16,150,000 individuals cohabiting. There were over 8 million cohabiting households. And of those cohabiting households, 4 out of 10 were raising children under the age of 18. Most of those cohabiting households, and when I say most, I mean the overwhelming majority of those cohabiting households are unstable. They will break up. The overwhelming majority. And yet, here's what our kids think about this. Now, this is confusing, I know, but let me put it in this term. Only 4 of 10 evangelical males and females between the ages of 15 and 22 think living together out of wedlock is wrong. Evangelicals. Only 4 of 10 evangelical young people between the ages of 15 and 22 believe that living together out of wedlock is wrong. If you go to those who are attending church every week, it gets better, but it's still half of weekly church-going evangelical young people between the ages of 15 and 22 think that living together out of wedlock is okay. Among those 23 to 32 years old, over 2/3 of evangelical males and females did not think it was wrong to live together with somebody out of wedlock. And even among those who attended church every week, over 40% of males and over 50% of females have no problem with it. Now, one thing I've encouraged pastors and elders to do, and very few take me up on this proposition. Survey your young people in an environment that lets them tell you honestly what they are doing and thinking. And don't judge them for it. Find out what's going on between their ears and in their private lives. You will never be able to address it unless you know. And you're never going to know if you approach them with a flamethrower or you're only preaching in one direction. You have to ask them. Because I would just encourage any church, including my own, do you think you're the exception or not? And if you are the exception, what percentage of young people in your church think that sex outside of marriage and living together outside of wedlock, A, decreases their chances of divorce, and B, is morally acceptable. You might be shocked at the answer, and that's okay, because that's where you start from. You start with truth. You work forward from there. You have to have compassion. You have to be willing to approach this in a very calm way, I think. Okay. One way I used to put it is, you should want to know, you don't want to know what's in your children's closets. That's why you got to check. Because if you don't want to know, it's because you suspect that there's something there that you wish wasn't there. But you can't help them if you don't know.
Like on your last graph there, what happened in 2000? Is there any?
This one?
Yeah.
The skies broke open. It literally just began to accelerate like crazy. And it's continuing to, it's tabling out now because it's hitting a top point. When I was born, it was 50,000. It just accelerated. And by the way, these things always build geometrically because they network out. As the more it's common among your peer group, the more it's going to accelerate. It's like throwing an accelerant on a fire, right? It can go from this big to this big very quickly because you've created the environment in which it can grow. You've suddenly blown oxygen into the room.
I understand the question that he asked. I'm wondering if it might have to do with boomers. You know, it's like a second boom because you have the boomers, children coming of age, and around maybe that period of time becoming old enough to make these decisions for themselves. So maybe there was a whole pool of young adults. I'm just wondering.
Well, yeah, you'd have some of that. The baby boom lasted till about 1963. So if you talk about the last of the baby boomers, would be 63 to 64. They'd have been coming of age, just add 18 to 20 to that number. So that still puts you in the 80s. But remember, cohabitation is also accelerating among elderly couples as well. It's going through all areas of society. It's also accelerating among divorcing couples. So a couple's married 10 years, they break up. Chances are their next relationship is going to be cohabiting.
No, I was talking about boomers' children.
Oh, boomers' children, yeah. Yeah, you have that, sure. But I think a lot of this really just has to do with what in sociology is called the network effect. Namely that if you go 1 to 2, it's going to go 2 to 4, it's going to go 4 to 8, it's going to go 8 to 16 because of the way that peer networks work and the way that people formulate what they view as normal. It relies on the people around them. So you end up reaching this critical mass in which you often have these types of demographic explosions. By the way, sadly enough, we're finding this today with transgenderism too. Suddenly everybody's transgender. Suddenly everybody's uncertain with regards to their orientation. That has to do with accelerants within those peer networks.
Social media has a lot to do with it too.
Oh, and the media, yeah. Social media, yeah.
Media too.
I think too it's interesting that boom happens in 2000. You talk about networks. That's the internet revolution starts.
Well, that's a very good point.
You know, when I was in high school, we were just starting to get the internet. And now we have ways to communicate these ideas that aren't coming from our parents. I can get thoughts and philosophies on dating and life from 4 sources outside the home and outside the church. And it's coming in through the computer screen, and I can be networked through what I want to do.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, raising children is tougher than ever, partly because we have so little control over what they're exposed to. Maybe we could add one other thing to that. The social media environment is toxic, but it's particularly toxic to people presenting traditional ideas and going against the tide. So a lot of people that have private doubts about these things are unwilling to express them on social media because they'll be attacked, and the attacks aren't just on social media anymore. The attacks are they're going to call your boss and try to get you fired. The attacks are that somebody else where you work is going to pick up on it and decide that you shouldn't be getting a promotion. Those are the attacks that are spilling out, and so it's even to some extent selective, isn't it? social media favors some things coming forward. And we like to make Facebook the bad guy or the controllers like Twitter, right? And they are bad, but it's actually the environment itself. You see, if somebody's out there promoting something that I disagree with, I'll either shut up or I'll disagree with it civilly. I'm not going to try to destroy them, wreck their relationships, and try to get them fired. But that's not shared by everyone out there, is it? And that tends to be targeted in a very predictable direction from what I've seen.
So not to defend social media, but to play devil's advocate, the rise of social media coincides with the slowdown of people who are on the graph.
Well, oh, wait a second. What happened to my graph?
I'm more curious what you think that slowdown
There?
related to with that social media.
First of all, that's cohabitation, but a couple things. One is you reach a table. I mean, in other words, you reach a saturation point where the market of people who would be willing to cohabit has tapped out. But the other thing is, remember, that's just a 2-year period there, whereas here we're dealing with 10-year periods. So let's see what happens. Would be the other thing I would say. But there's also a market saturation point for these types of things.
As somebody who teaches 7th graders, you do see the younger generation start to push back against it. Like I see a lot of kids who get their phones taken away. I can think of one girl in particular who had her phone taken away, and it's like a relief. Because, so they'll fight and say, you hate me or whatever. But you take that away, you take away the pressure of social media, and all of a sudden you find that boundary, you find that comfort in your parents and in your home and where it's supposed to be. And I feel like I'm hopeful that the current generation is starting to recognize what happened in the previous 10 years and is starting to push back against that a little bit and to see the insanity.
Yeah. I don't think it's sustainable. I think eventually it has to collapse. And that's where, too, just to tag back here real quick, if I could do that. Oh, sorry. That's actually farther back than I thought. That's what they were finding. In a totally secular, liberal environment, that's what they were finding, is that there's a blowback. People are now finding that they're coming up empty. They're starting to look at the past and say, is there a better way to do this? Do I have to go into marriage in my mid-30s burned out on relationships, burned out on sex, burned out on people walking out on me or using me for their own purposes? And, interestingly enough, they're finding that Darcy and Bingley don't look so bad. This one here is the percentage who agreed with the statement that living together before marriage may prevent divorce. Now, here's an interesting one here, and this speaks to something you were saying about the pushback. Notice that among people 15 to 22 years old, 55% of evangelicals between 15 and 22 years old thought that living together might prevent divorce. Now, that's not a good thing. But look what happens when you go right to the older ones. Do you see that they're a little less enamored with this than the older people are? When you go to people 33 to 44, 63% of evangelicals think that living together may prevent divorce. Among the younger people, they're less likely to feel that way. Now, still most of them do, but do you see that retreat in the other direction? Still, if you look at even among weekly church attenders, males and females, and I encourage people to think this way, not because it can help you be constructive in how you approach this. Think that there's a very good chance that at Beverly Heights EPC Church, that among your young people, a large proportion of them think, I don't know what that proportion is, think that living together before marriage is all right, think that sex outside of marriage is all right, and think that actually it might even make their marriage better if they do this, and you can't talk to them about it until you know what they think. In other words, find out. I'm really hoping that, in fact, your percentage is 0, but I doubt that. I don't think that's true in my church. Okay. Consequences and concerns. First of all, and by the way, I'm going to stick to consequences and concerns that secular social scientists note, based on, first of all, the logic of the action and what its logical outcome would be, and then what they see statistically happens. First of all, young people are separated from oversight and counsel of parents and elders while relying heavily on their age peers in picking partners. They tend to focus very heavily on personal ends, feelings, status, sex, immediate gratification types of things in forming these relationships. There's a clear link to sexual activity outside of marriage, more intense and with greater numbers of partners. Over 98% of people today have had sex before they've gotten married. Now, what makes this different, by the way, first of all, the absolute percentage is higher, but you know what really makes it different than 60 years ago, let's say when my mom was young? That percentage was still pretty high, but it was usually only one person, and that person was the person they ended up marrying. Now it's 4, 5, 6. Which, by the way, also is a physical nightmare because of the degree to which that transmits STDs. Early dating is especially problematic, more than most people realize. It's tied to more sex, to having sex earlier, to being less likely to use birth control during sex, and to having sex with more partners. And I hate throwing a bunch of statistics out there. 56% of males who began dating by age 14, but remember that's about half now, right? Had their first sexual intercourse by the time they turned 15. And then another 30% of those started having sex between the ages of 16 and 17, and they're very specific, sexual intercourse. Among those who waited to age 17 to date, however, only 7% had had intercourse by the time they were 15, and 63% waited until they were 18, older, or until they got married. Now, the difference between those is dramatic, very dramatic. The other thing is that for women, early dating is heavily tied to sexual assault. That shouldn't surprise us. If a 14-year-old girl is being put in a dating situation privately, apart from parental authority, what are her chances of being sexually assaulted? Well, it turns out 1 out of 5 of them, 1 out of 5 girls who start dating by age 14 end up being forcibly raped. That's the most serious form of rape, except rape accompanied by actual injury. Now, think about that. Why would, if we knew, and we don't, why would we put women in that situation where they have a 1 out of 5 chance of suffering forcible rape? It doesn't make any sense. That drops by 2/3 to half if they wait after that, depending on the age. They're dating too early. And if we're talking about group dating, if we're talking about chaperone church picnics, that's a different ballgame, but that's not what we're talking about. Here's a word of wisdom for me, I suppose. This is an explosive revelation for which I hope I'm going to be cited and quoted to the end of my life and made famous. Immaturity coupled with heightened opportunity and temptation to have sex is kind of a bad combination. We used to have a term for this. It was called common sense. But as we know, common sense is not common. But oftentimes, people just aren't informed. And you accept as normal what the people around you are doing. We're choosing spouses as if they were recreational partners, recreational dating partners. This is kind of an interesting one. This is a quote from my book, but I'm drawing on a couple of secular authors here. For example, drawing on an interesting study comparing preferences for romantic partners between adolescents in 4 countries, including the United States, Starbuck and Lundy pointed out that American teens looked for the following qualities in a dating partner: fun, sexy, have money. Whereas when you go to more traditional societies, for example, peasant kids in Central America was one of the groups they focused on. People that are supposed to be ignorant and uneducated, right? They favor, does this person like children and would they be a good parent? They go on to warn, Americans are likely to carry adolescent perceptions of the ideal opposite sex person well into adulthood. These ideals might not be the best criteria for selecting a lifelong partner. Not only are obviously practical considerations being downplayed, but qualities specifically tied to the time-honored goals of marriage: practical support, sexual honor, the desire and ability to have children and raise them well, have little to do with modern day. And they've mastered the art of breaking up. I mentioned this before. I got it all. How do you break up with nice people? How do you break up with jerks? How do you dump someone? How do you do it nicely? And so on. One professional counseling site offered a surefire, easy 3-step method. Another focused on helping teenagers break up. As I write, or I could say as I speak, there are probably millions of Americans using the internet to think through how to drop some lover from their lives. And on the other side of that equation is a person who is about to get dumped and doesn't know it yet. And how many teachers do we have in here? Does that distract them? It does more than distract them. So here's some quick do's and don'ts. Sorry. First of all, early and unsupervised dating is a bad idea. Okay, there we have it. It's a Christian event. It must be okay. Don't make that assumption. The parents, there's going to be parents there. You better make sure they're not cool parents. Encouraging exclusive, steady dating detached from marriage intentions. Missionary dating. I know they're not a believer, but I figure if I date them, they'll turn into one. Doesn't always work out. And don't let them get into situations that invite sexual temptation and opportunity. If any man or woman thinks he stands, let him take heed lest they fall. On the other hand, do have, within the structure, I think, of how your church and you relate to young people, biblical and practical teaching on sex and cohabitation. They should learn what the scriptures say about this, and they should also learn the practical realities and facts about this, both. You should encourage Christian dating couples to integrate their dating life into the life of the church, to spend time with each other's families, become part of those family units. So if my son is dating someone, I want them to be comfortable in our home, and I want them to be going to church together. You see what I'm saying? Prayer and Christian growth should be part of their relationship. Studying the Bible together, studying solid teaching together, talking about the things of God, praying together. We should be providing opportunity for Christian singles to mingle in positive group settings, creating opportunities for them to get to know each other. We should be teaching young people that emotional and romantic intimacy should never be a game. It's not recreation. It's not fun. Play lacrosse if you want to have fun. Play basketball if you want to have fun. Do Kidditch if you want to have fun. But romance for fun is not a good idea. Have the courage to find out what young people are really thinking, what they're really doing, and what they're really believing. And then the other thing is Encourage singles towards trusting patience in our sovereign, loving God to accomplish all His holy will in their lives. Parents and singles alike need to trust their wise and loving God to provide a suitable marriage partner in due time. So often I see young men and women leaving our Christian college, Grove City College, despondent because they have not yet become engaged or married, and they believe that their quest for a godly spouse is now about to become even harder. This is especially so for those who saw a relationship that they hoped would end in engagement, not lead to that result. Their hopes are dashed, they're graduating, they're going into the workforce, they haven't found that spouse, they're discouraged. Yet myself and so many others that I know found loving, wonderful, believing partners in the midst of secular environments and pursuits, especially when we remain committed members of biblical churches. God is faithful. If marriage is in His plan, He will bring it to pass. And it is enough to rest in that. Or to put it shortly, don't rush into marriage just because you think it will pass you by. You're not big enough to frustrate God's plan for your life. He has a way of getting it done in spite of you even sometimes, right? Okay, I guess we're towards the end of our time. By the way, I really enjoyed the questions and thoughts and anything else before we, and remember, at the beginning of any class, please feel free to raise stuff and please feel free to write me or anything else you'd like to do to follow up on this. And then next week, we'll be getting into the practical wisdom in choosing a mate. So we'll get even earthier.